Olá, estamos aqui para o nosso 7º episódio, nosso podcast da reforma que poderá mudar o jogo, ou a reforma que já mudou o jogo. Hoje a gente tem o André aqui comigo, a gente já está aqui junto desde o primeiro episódio e a gente tem um convidado super especial, nosso sócio responsável por tributos e indiretos globalmente na KPMG, que vai dividir toda a experiência com a gente, contar um pouco do que deu certo em outros países, dos perrengues e como que a gente vive com esse tema no outro Brasil. Agora nós vamos mudar para o inglês, para que a gente possa fazer a comunicação com o nosso líder global da KPMG. So now I switch to English, and now you have the special people here with us, Lachlan, our global head of tax, data and legal at KPMG International. So Lachlan, could you please introduce yourself to Brazilian survivors who worked with tax in Brazil?
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I lead KPMG's global indirect tax practice. I'm also the global head of data for tax and legal for KPMG. And it's great to be with you today.
Thank you. And my first question for you is who is Lachlan outside of KPMG?
Wow. So I'm married with 3 kids. I've got a 12-year-old, a 4-year-old, and it's my youngest 2-year-old's birthday today. So as you can imagine, with young children, I don't get a whole lot of time outside of work for fun things. But what I would say is that when my wife got pregnant, I put on a bit of weight in sympathy for her. And now I'm trying to lose that weight by getting fit by running and swimming.
Okay, thank you. And my first technical question for you. I think you know Brazil has one of the most complicated or sophisticated tax scenario when you think about the indirect tax. As the global partner for indirect tax at KPMG, you certainly have followed many tax reform around the world. If you could you tell us a bit more about that experience?
So let me just start by saying this. The most complex indirect tax systems in the world are usually referred to as the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And I would say Brazil is the most complex of all of those. In terms of my own involvement, I started my career working with the implementation of GST in Australia back in the year 2000. And then I worked on the implementation of VAT in China in the period from 2012 through to 2016. And I've also had some involvement in the implementation of GST in Malaysia in 2015 and in India in 2017. And I guess what I can say is, in every case, I can remember exactly where I was at midnight on the day of the changeover because I was beyond exhausted. It was by far the most exhilarating and the best career experience of my life. In other words, for those starting out a career in tax, I would say you get 5 years of experience in 1 year through working on an implementation project as complex as you're going to experience in Brazil.
Yeah.
Okay. André, your turn. You can ask for
yeah, and based on all these countries that you already described, which one you think it's the one that the transformation was bigger and the one that was most difficult to be implemented, considering all the transformation in the system?
So it's a really good question, and I promise I'm not being diplomatic in saying this, but all of the countries, the complexity was all along a similar line, which was you had different levels of government imposing different forms of indirect tax, and the overall objective in implementing a VAT or a GST was to bring together a unified tax system. So we saw that in Australia, we saw that a lot in China, and we've seen it in countries like India as well. And I think what I've learned through that process is amongst the hardest things that governments have is trying to manage the political compromise between the different levels of government. And I think that's clearly a key component to what we see is going to happen in Brazil as well. So it's the fact of trying to manage the different relationships between the central government versus what happens at the state or provincial level. That's a common feature that I've seen that has made it complex in all of those different countries that I've worked on.
Hearing what you are saying, it's like I'm hearing about Brazil. I can tell you, here we will have the same thing.
Yes, it's the same.
So it's interesting. I remember a Chinese government official once said to me, in China, they can change things very quickly. They can build whole cities in overnight, but you try and change who collects the taxes, that's a far more complex exercise than building whole new cities in place. And I think that is very relevant to the experience you're going to have in Brazil.
Yeah, I think it's very, very high the probability that we will face the same problem here.
Yeah.
And in these countries, what do you think it were the main issues that the companies faced? It was the ERPs, it was the laws, which
the people, the process.
The process, yeah. The training of the people, which you think it's the main issues?
So it's a really good question. And what I would say is, as tax professionals, we tend to think that the most difficult issues are the tax technical issues. And it's not. It's absolutely not. The most challenging issues in implementing this sort of change is around the systems changes, the processes, the impact on pricing and contracts, the impact on sales and marketing teams, and all of the business functions in the organization. So if you step back from the detail for a minute, you've got to realize that when you're implementing any VAT system, you need to have the whole organization develop at least some understanding of how those changes are going to impact the business from a commercial perspective, not simply a tax perspective. So I would say it's the impact right across the organization rather than the tax technical issues, which are clearly the most significant issues that businesses need to focus on.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear, because it's that when we talk about taxes, everyone is concerned about the technical, my ERP, everything else, but no.
But it's not. You're totally agree with you. It's important to understand, to know about the technical related to VAT, the old or the new. However, the tax person in Brazil can understand about contract, pricing, supply, and ERP, and much more than technical. Yeah.
And maybe just to add to that, Belle, I often describe the implementation of VAT. It's a little bit like climbing a mountain. When you're climbing the mountain, it's very difficult. Mm-hmm. And there'll be times when you want to give up, yes. And there are times when you'll fall down a bit.
Yeah.
But once you get to the top, the view is quite good.
Yes.
And I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that the most difficult aspect is the immediate change in implementing. But if you ask most businesses 1 year after the implementation, they'll sit there and say, this is no longer a big deal. It's business as usual. And so the hardest thing is climbing to that mountain.
It's good. It's good for us to listen that. Yeah. And Lachlan, all the companies in Brazil are afraid about the one topic here, to recover VAT tax credit, because nowadays it's a huge problem in Brazil. Some companies don't reimbursement this kind of credit. This is all the companies in Brazil are afraid about this matter. So does this fast recovery system work in other countries?
So I wish I could tell you a lot of good news, but I can't. Okay? I think there's reason why businesses should be a little concerned. Obviously, I can't speak to the position in Brazil, but based on international experience, let me tell you a little bit about that. Back in 2014, I carried out a global survey of the VAT or GST refund or reimbursement practices of different countries around the world. And what we saw was not all that positive. For example, you had countries that would be very slow in refunding. You would have countries where mere small defects in tax invoices would result in a disallowance of credits or refunds, even though the underlying substance of the transaction was legitimate. You also saw situations where refund requests would trigger tax audits for companies, or refunds were not available to all types of taxpayers across all industries. To be fair to governments, they need to be very careful, because whenever you start giving refunds, there are instances of fraud, and obviously they need to make sure they manage fraud. But the balance is how to minimize fraud while at the same time facilitating legitimate businesses claiming and getting the benefits or their entitlements that they're eligible for. So again, all I'm trying to say is I think people should be skeptical about this issue. The experience internationally is not all that positive.
Okay, thank you. And my other question is, in companies outside of Brazil which have already adopted for the VAT system, what are the main focus for the companies in compliance, controversy, litigation, technology? Because in Brazil, the companies spend a lot of time in compliance to adopt for the information for the taxpayers, and in outside, what the company measure that in compliance, controversy, litigation, or which one?
So it's a good question. Let me just start by saying this. When I look across our KPMG practices around the world, historically, I would say that something around 60% of the work that we do is giving advice to companies on how to comply. 25% is our compliance business, and about 15% was focused on things like controversy as well. But that's all changing. What I would say is that so much of what we now do is about implementing technology so that we can automate the decision-making, we can manage risk through the technology, we can manage compliance through the technology. The analogy I would use is the role of an indirect tax professional is now a bit more about being the pilot at the seat of an aeroplane that's very sophisticated, rather than trying to do all of those different components themselves. The only other thing I would say from experience is Brazil, like many other countries, has quite a lot of tax litigation and disputes. The experience I've seen is that often takes 4 or 5 years after implementation before those disputes happen, typically because the tax authorities have to learn how to audit, and taxpayers often given a bit of leniency to comply in the early years.
Thank you.
Yeah, and based on your experience and all these tax reform that you followed, is the average time that this tax reform took to be in place?
Yeah, because in Brazil you have the 10 years for transitions. In the start and the end is around 10 years.
I see you've got implementation in Brazil on a phased basis, I think from 2026 through to 2033. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yep. So that is quite unusual. A little bit similar to the experience I had in China, where they did the implementation over a period from 2012 through to 2016 on a phased implementation approach. I guess what I would say is two things. Number one, some countries have adopted what I'll call a big bang approach, where basically there was one day, everything changed all at once. I think given the complexity of the situation in Brazil, that's too difficult for them to do. And so I completely understand why they want to do that phased approach.
Mm-hmm.
The benefit of that approach, obviously, it gives the tax authorities an opportunity to make changes as they go and for businesses to be able to adapt to the impact of those changes as they go and learn as you go through it. The second thing is that I would say that most countries try and allow about 18 months lead time between when they announce the legislation and when they commence it. That's the experience in Australia. It was about 18 months, but in China it was about 6 weeks.
Wow.
6 weeks?
Which was
they built
which is the reason I have grey hair.
I have to.
Wow.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. Wow. They built
you have to learn.
You
have to learn with the other countries, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And
it's my turn?
Yeah.
And I know, KPMG has been using artificial intelligence in tax around the world. In particular, in countries where the VAT systems has already implemented. Could you share with us some interesting cases related to artificial intelligence in VAT or in tax?
Yeah, so I guess a couple of things. Firstly, I think artificial intelligence will have a dramatic effect on how indirect taxes are managed, because I think so much of what we do can be automated through the use of artificial intelligence, through leveraging artificial intelligence together with things like data and analytics capabilities. And I think we're seeing just the very early stages of it today. So the first thing I would say is that I have this feeling that artificial intelligence is unlike any other change we've experienced before in our professional careers. And I think we're going to look back a few years from now and realize how little we knew about it in 2024. And so the first thing I would say is that my advice to businesses, to anyone, is start playing with artificial intelligence. It's one of those things that you have to learn it by doing it. Don't sit there thinking about how to make it perfect. You have to do a bit of trial and error, and you have to learn. And you have to ask yourself the question, where could I deploy AI to help my decision-making processes, not replace them? And how do I help to automate a process to make it more efficient? But I think starting with some existing examples, for example, using AI to translate my voice from English into Portuguese is a very simple start.
Yes.
But all of us can use it in meetings we're doing every day. We can use it to help to automate part of the work that we do. But ultimately, what we're also learning is how to ensure that our role as human beings is effectively sitting at the end of the process to analyze, to ensure the accuracy of the AI and to test that out as part of the process. So I think there is a term that we increasingly use, which is AI should augment what we do. It shouldn't replace what we do. And I think in indirect tax, that's very, very true.
So just to share with you, Andre and I, recently, the government published the regulatory law about the indirect tax. It's around 500 articles, and it starts at 8 p.m., yeah?
Yeah.
And we used the artificial intelligence to read all the legislation, and you published the post in 1 hour and a half.
Yeah, the artificial intelligence summarized all the articles and gave us a first draft of the resume.
Yeah.
And that's a great use case. That's not particularly complex to do, but I think more and more companies are going to do that. And as I said, I think start with some simple things like that.
Yes.
And then I can see it getting more and more mature as we go.
Yeah.
And I think the last one, but not the minus important. Do you think the Brazilian move from the nowadays methodology for the VAT, GST, it was a good idea, or we should keep our current tax model?
It's impossible to say.
So speaking as a non-Brazilian, I will tell you that the indirect tax system in Brazil, as I said at the start, is amongst the most complex in the world. ICMS, ISS, PIS, COFINS, IPI, every time I need to look it up to remind myself about all the different taxes. So I would say from a complexity perspective, moving towards the new dual VAT system is a good thing. And I think it's a long overdue reform in Brazil's economy. I think I've been doing this for long enough, Belle, that I remember Brazilian indirect tax reform has been on the agenda for more than 10 years now.
Yes.
So I think it's great to see it come to fruition. I think the only thing I would say to businesses, in my experience, is that when you're dealing with a complex reform like this, there's a temptation to wait for certainty on a whole bunch of issues. And my advice is don't. Don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. In other words, sometimes you need to make business decisions based on imperfect information. It's going to take time to build up certainty, but you need to get moving because all of the impacts on pricing, contracts, sales, marketing, systems, they often have a lot longer lead time than we do as tax professionals. So I think, getting started on that implementation approach early is really critical.
Yeah, that's a great advice.
Yeah, it's good for us, for Brazilians, to listen something about that, because the moment is not easier for us. A lot of people here, the taxpayer, the tax authority, the consultant, the lawyers are afraid about that. However, you have to change that. This scenario, it's impossible to stay in this scenario like nowadays. And Lachlan, thank you so much for sharing your experience in this matter. I really think that your experience would be very welcome for Brazilians, for us, me and Andre, and I think you should move to Brazil to help us with this big challenge. And my last question, but not least, what do you think of this idea to move to Brazil?
So Belle, let me just say this. I would love to come to Brazil. I would love to talk to and meet with many of your clients and talk about how you go about the implementation. But I'm not crazy enough to move to Brazil. Your indirect tax system is too complex for me at my age.
It's not. It's easier
Let's
for
have
you.
this conversation 10 years.
And then use before,
10 years
from now.
Yeah.
in the end of the transition, maybe you can think about that. So, thank you so much. So you switch for Portuguese. to the end of your podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bom, tivemos uma super experiência aqui de ouvir o nosso líder global de Indiretos, que teve muita experiência com outros países. Fiquei impressionada com a rapidez da China de implementação. Quem sabe a gente não aprende com eles. Acho que a gente tem muito caminho pela frente, mas saber que a gente provavelmente está no caminho certo dá um conforto, e agora a gente tem que trabalhar em tudo que está aí, nas publicações, nas regulamentações, e ser efetivamente protagonista do tema, né, André?
Exatamente, aproveitar os conselhos que foi nos dado, acho que tem grande valor, né, considerando a experiência internacional em vários modelos de VAT, então acho que foi uma ótima oportunidade de ouvir a experiência internacional.
E não acaba por aqui, né? A gente vai chamar ele de novo, inclusive nossos parceiros de outros países que já têm grandes experiências com a implementação do VAT. Obrigada e espero que vocês tenham gostado do nosso podcast.